Thanks everybody for coming out. I know it's there was a lot of competing talks for this afternoon slot, so we're excited that you're here. Brief introductions. My name is Henry Sowell. I'm the technical director for Hortonworks Public Sector. We do a bunch of different stuff for the government across everything from the Intel community down to state and local governments. I've got with me John Hycock, who is a system architect in our public sector region and has done many different Hadoop deployments throughout the field. Today's an interesting talk that matters a lot to us in the public sector, but also applies to uses in the commercial space as well, through how do we do a better job at making it easy to manage access control for Accumulo. And so we're going to talk about the work that we've done for integrating Apache Accumulo and Apache Ranger. If you notice, there was a third name up here. His name's Marcus Wainio. Amazing. He got sick, so on Sunday, I found out I'm doing this talk. So bear with me as I stumble through a couple notes, but the real expert here is John, and he'll be covering a really great part of this conversation. So one of the first things that we're going to talk about today is defining ABAC, attribute-based access control. We're going to give an overview of Apache Ranger. And then we're going to give you a definition and walkthrough of Apache Accumulo security as it is now, and then give you an integration demo of those two tools, and then a over-the-horizon view on the future work that we're doing on that integration. So starting out, what is ABAC? Attribute-based access control is a method where you take a subject, a person who is trying to perform some sort of operation on an object, some data, and is granted or denied access to that object based on a set of attributes and environmental variables that a policy is defined, whether they can or cannot access that. I'll talk a little bit about the particulars of that. When you look at an attribute, when you think about attribute, these are specific characteristics that are inherent to the data, either for the subject or the object. When you look at a subject can be a person entity, so think a user on a system, or it can actually be a non-person entity, think of a system or a service account. And a service account would be, think of if you were setting up a job that was in charge of migrating data periodically. That would be an example of a non-person entity. So these are assigned describing what they can access. It's independent of the data, and changes to these attributes do not require a re-ingest of data. An example attribute for a subject would be an LDAP group or an organization attribute. It could be many different things. So what is that subject doing? That subject is trying to access or to perform an operation on an object. And when they're trying to perform that on a specific object, that could be a resource, such as a system, a database, some sort of protected data. When you look at these attributes, the attributes for objects are telling how to protect it. An example, and you want to get as low to the level of the type of data that it is. So an example would be PII, PHI, right? Think of some way that you're telling about it, and that's separate. The tag that's on that data is separate from the policies that may define it. So you may have policies written today that describe how you handle PII or PHI data, but they may change, and that policy can change independent of your data, which is part of the not having to re-ingest your data every time you make an update or change. This third portion here is environment. And these can change from session to session. They may be ephemeral. Think of them as examples would be like a geolocation or a device or something to that effect. And all of this comes together to, you create a policy which is, establishes rules and relationships that determine how do you control access behavior based on the attributes for subjects, objects, and environment, and for the environment. When you write a policy, it's written from from an object's perspective that needs protecting, and the privileges available to the subjects. Give you an example off the top of my head, which is always a good way to do a presentation off the top of your head. Imagine that I am a researcher at an organization, and I need to access PII data. I am attempting to access it from my personal computer, and I am outside of the country, right? So I've just described to you several different pieces about my part in the organization, the data I'm accessing and the attributes associated with that data, and I have given you environmental variables, my geolocation, and the device that I'm using. Now, the policy would come into place where I would say, for PII data, the user has to access during normal business hours. They have to be, I probably shouldn't have given the one that I didn't assign an attribute in the example. They have to belong to the research part of our arm. Our guy's good for that. They have to be a part of they have to be on the company network, and they have to be located in the United States. Okay, well, based on that policy, I would not gain access to the data because I have, there are two attributes that I don't meet that criteria. Make sense? So why use ABAC? It provides a consistent implementation of these centralized policies, and also allows you to centralize how you manage objects and attributes. And this is extremely important when you talk about changes. I kind of highlighted a change of if I change the policy of how we handle PII data, does anybody have to deal with policy changes in the organization? Right? Yeah, I have government representatives that are well aware of this. Those types of changes can drastically affect how you go about accessing data. In the old organization that I worked for, in the Department of Justice, we had a setup where there was, I'm going to give some rough random numbers, but it was bad. It was a situation where they had 10 different access control mechanisms that were enforced, where if there was a change, we had to re-ingest the data within these different organizations. That's highly problematic, doesn't allow you to be flexible, doesn't allow you to adjust to needs and changes in your organization. So that's some of the advantages that you get with ABAC. So what's Apache Ranger? Apache Ranger was created by a company called XA Secure. If you look at the history of the Hadoop ecosystem, there were a couple of people that were attempting to create security products. Most of them, or all of them, were proprietary. Not all of them used ABAC. When we saw XA Secure, Hortonworks decided to purchase them in 2014 and immediately open sourced them, put them into the Apache Software Foundation. It is the only fully open source Hadoop ecosystem ABAC security, comprehensive data security. So it's pretty unique. It provides centralized policy management and audit. So if you were to go through the Ranger interface, you could manage the security policies and access control for over 10 different ecosystem components, including what you see here with Hadoop, even NiFi, various components in the Hadoop ecosystem. And one really cool piece is it provides distributed policy decision points and policy enforcement. And so what does this mean? That when I have a policy decision that I'm making on one node, I am not, every time I need to make an access control decision, having to DDoS my policy server. It is actually asynchronous by having those policies kept on each node, and that when a decision needs to be made and you try to, say, access Hive, what's actually happening is the API call is getting intercepted by Ranger, and you're getting an authorization check there locally, and then that decision is made. So it's fast distributed, and it is also allows you to withstand if something were to happen to, say, your policy server, because it would take the latest update that you've received. Is that good? Mm-hmm. He's checking me. I was supposed to talk about this on Sunday. So, all right. So for a deeper overview of how Apache Ranger works, I'm going to hand it over to John, and John's going to describe this Apache Accumulo and go into our demo.
All right. Hi. So as Henry mentioned, all of the policy-related interactions that occur for enforcement for Ranger plugins are in the actual services running. So for Accumulo, for instance, you have the T servers distributed over whatever nodes you have them on. Anytime an interaction needs to occur that would result in an enforcement decision, the cached policy that it retrieved from the admin server is queried for that particular interaction. So you don't have to query the admin UI each time, and you have a relatively quick interaction that occurs for determining whether that access was appropriate or not, and it will send off the audit event to, as you can see, HDFS or Solar, or both, depending upon which one you have configured. So why use it with Accumulo? It's really the best solution for an ABAC implementation within the Hadoop ecosystem. The resource-based policy management within the Ranger API aligns very well with the pluggable security model that Accumulo has, which I'll talk about in a moment. Because of that model, you get to easily leverage the security features within Accumulo, and they sort of synergize rather well with the Ranger stuff. And then, as I mentioned, the distributed architecture works pretty well with the way Accumulo is put together. And the centralized policy management and audit is already there for many of the Hadoop ecosystem components within Ranger. So you get to take advantage of a lot of stuff that's kind of already there. So the Accumulo security, and I will, for this part, is just the pluggable security model. There are 3 bits to it, the authentication, permissions, and authorizations. Each one of them has an interface that needs to be implemented. Out of the box, those are the Zookeeper permission, or Zookeeper authentication, permission, and authorization. That's the default in Apache, as well as in HTTP, whatever. So for the authentication bit, an interaction occurs, such as adding a user, querying what users are available. Those are all stored in Zookeeper. For permissions, those are system table namespace, so standard operations on those types of things, like reading from a table, creating a table, writing to a table, that sort of thing. And then the authorizations bit, which is maybe new depending upon your exposure to these types of topics, would be the authorizations in the actual records within Accumulo. So they allow you to provide a Boolean expression of different resources from the Ranger perspective of things that are appropriate for somebody to access. Does not support not operators for good reason. So there's also the Kerberos implementation of those done by Josh Elser. And those, for the most part, do the same Zookeeper type interactions, but make sure that any sort of quirks of performing those Kerberos token manipulations in the Zookeeper Z nodes don't have any problems. So for the integration status, I made a plugin within Accumulo. Well, it's within a Ranger, and it implements the Accumulo pluggable security model. So it does resource-based management of the table namespace, system, and authorizations. You can see what I mean by resource and those things I'll show you in the GUI in a moment. And so I made the plugin for the demo that I'll show you in a moment. There is a Docker Compose that just consists of a couple different containers with a simple MySQL database for the backend of Ranger, a KDC, MIT KDC, and an Ambari node and a data node. And it's on my GitHub if you're interested. It'll also be updated on the Ranger 919 ticket eventually. Okay, so demo. So this is the simple cluster that's running on just my laptop, just the bare bones of what's necessary in order to do the demo. Infer's only there because it provides Solar. Other than that, if you've been exposed to any of these technologies, these all make sense for why they're there. For the user assignment, I didn't have it sync up with an LDAP endpoint for simplicity's sake, so I just hard-coded the mapping for the users. So you have Dr. Bob as a doctor, Tom is in reception, Jane's in billing. So the policy stuff that Henry mentioned and that I believe I also alluded to. So this is within the container. So you have the different JSON caches for the policies that have been synced to this node. And those get updated periodically. So if the admin server, as you mentioned, goes down, it's still going to use the last. Depending upon your security implementation, that may or may not be okay, but I don't know how else, off the top of my head, you would do that without DDoSing things. So in our simple example, we have a couple different policies set up. So for the, we'll say, PHI example, you can see that it's been assigned specifically to the Dr. Bob user. Specifically to the Dr. Bob user. Okay, it timed out. So there's the policy name. The authorization is for the PHI authorization, which is what would be in the record, which we'll see in a moment. It's the specific user and the all for the permissions. I just picked every single one of them for the moment, but for authorization, it's just, is it in the list or not, based on that permission handler. For another user, so we'll say for Tom, Tom is not actually specified manually in any of these policies, so his is done only via group. So he's in the reception group, and he's granted authorization for the masked PII and masked PHI authorizations. And then you can see here, and I can show you a chart if it makes it easier for the remainder of the demo. Different people have different permissions, but that will sort of flow for the scans. So for the first example, we have Dr. Bob. He's in the office namespace, the patient table. If I perform a scan, there's a little quirk in the Accumulo shell where if it doesn't detect that you've specified authorizations, it then queries the total set and then submits that instead. So these are all the authorizations for Dr. Bob. So you have the key structure for this very simple, poorly constructed table, which would be 1 is in the row, blood type is the column family, A is the column qualifier, and PHI is the authorization. There's no value for this particular key. So all of his permissions for authorization purposes were PHI and PII, so he sees all the records here. If you scan with nothing, then he only sees the records that have no authorizations provided. So he could scan with simply PII, and he would get everything that has nothing and only PII bits. Simple, but that's not super easy to do in an RBAC model and other security implementations. So it seemed interesting to me, at least. PII, PHI. So nope, doesn't actually exist. When you try to scan for it, you get an exception stating that you don't actually have the ability to scan for this because you have not been granted this authorization. That's the exact same message you get if you use one that does actually exist, but you haven't been granted. Same thing, you can't tell. You can't fish for what's in there or not in there. And there's no built-in convenient way of listing the authorizations of what's been put in your database, but you can scan for what you have assigned in Ranger. So all of these events were audited. As soon as I find my mouse. So these are the Dr. Bob audit events, starting here. So this was the initial scan. Is this legible? I can make it bigger. So he was, I accidentally clicked on it. He was granted the ability to read from this table, and he was granted the authorization for those authorizations. The next scan with nothing, he was able to read from the table, the individual PII event, the read with both of them, the read with the made-up one that doesn't actually exist, denied. Now this could be broken out to show the individual authorization that was denied. I just did not implement it that way because in the interface, it's just a question. User presents list of auths. Is this a yes or no? The policy manager and Ranger that's used there will give me an answer that I could use to break it out there. I just didn't yet. And then it looks the same for one that does actually exist, but he has not been granted authorizations for. So for Tom, again, in the office namespace patient table, and one distinction would be that Dr. Bob was granted based on the office namespace and no table specifically. So any tables in there he would be able to have access to with the same authorization set. Tom has been only granted office.patient, but the same kind of thing. So his total set of authorizations are mass PHI, mass PII. One thing to note here is another thing you can do in the cell-oriented model would be to store duplicates of information that only match the characteristics that you require. So for a masked entry, you can do what you wish there. Hive implements this sort of on the way out. The data is not stored as you wish to see it. They edit it before you see it when you do the masking. So if you were to scan with somebody that has all the authorizations, you would see two entries for SSN. One would be the PII that has the full number. One would be this masked entry. Funny little thing you can do. Same as Dr. Bob. If you scan with nothing, you get only the list of records that have no authorizations granted. And as for the other authorizations, again, only granted by group, but still enforcing. And if I were to just go to another table, he's told, no, you can't do that because he has not been granted access to the trace table, which is in the default namespace. And we'll see that when we go to the audit log. So the first one here is this one. So the scan with all of his authorizations because of the quirk of the shell. The scan with mass PHI. And the scan of trace, so he doesn't have access to the default namespace. He does not have access to the trace table. So it's nothing left for him to do there. So I had one for Accumulo, but it's not super interesting, and there's a lot of trace rights. In terms of the rest of the slides. So this is kind of a breakdown of the way their authorizations worked, for simplicity's sake. And you can see how they were granted. It's a little more palatable than just the Ranger view without actually clicking into each one and trying to remember what was there. And then just a bunch of screen caps in the event that...
Just in case everything went wrong,
yeah.
We had screen captures.
Yeah. Last time I did this, the resolution was a little different.
While you're going through that, I wanted to highlight something I think that's really important. If anybody in here has tried to do this at one of your organizations, implementing this is usually done with custom development, and it's complex and it's a one-off. Right? You don't have a community behind you that can participate in this, and using the Ranger framework really allows you to leverage what's out there and what's continuing to be developed, and it gives you a single interface that beyond just Accumulo, you have all of the other components in the Hadoop stack, and you have NiFi that you can manage your security from that centralized place. That's significant, and I think we really need to understand the gravity of this for our organizations. So pretty awesome work.
So a couple things that are left. You can change it so that within the pluggable security model implemented interfaces, it will intercept the commands to edit the standard things that would normally be done in Zookeeper and interact with the Ranger API so that it would make those modifications directly. I did not do that for the demo, but something that can be done. The consolidation of audit events. One thing I didn't mention earlier was the system audits are really chatty right now because where the pluggable security model sits is sort of a little beyond a bunch of calls that check the status of a bunch of those interface calls, which causes it to audit a lot. So that's disabled for the moment. And the T-server interactions end up giving an audit event for each query that you do per T-server. So if you have 1,000 T-servers and you do a scan, then you're going to get 1,000 audit events back, which is maybe okay depending upon your point of view, but I haven't done anything to try and roll those up or make a reasonable interaction for that. Ranger 919, like I mentioned, that's the Apache Jira that I made a couple years ago that I desperately need to update. The resource lookup for the table and namespace. So you saw the where you would specify which resource you're referring to and what the resource could be. It can auto-complete some stuff by querying the service that you're controlling. I have not configured it to do that, but probably pretty useful, much like the ability to edit it from the shell, depending upon your point of view. LDAP attribute sync, like Henry mentioned, you can store a lot of these things in your LDAP endpoint, whether it's AD or free IPA or OUD, whatever it is that you use for your LDAP. A lot of that stuff can be there and could be used and integrated with this so that you didn't have to store it all within Ranger if it's already being done in your Active Directory, or it could at least be cached into Ranger to be in the policy. And the Apache Atlas tag integration. I did not do anything with that. And I think...
Yeah, so still some work to be done. It'd be great to see where this goes, but awesome work, John. Yeah, awesome. At this time, I think what we'll do is we'll just open up to questions. There is a microphone here in the center, so if anybody has anything, we'd love to open it up. Or we could stand here awkwardly. No, but we do greatly appreciate everybody coming out today. And if you do have any other questions that you would like to bring up individually, please feel free to. And I think that's it for us. All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks.